Tonight we tell the story of Edward Gein, a quiet and unassuming man from a small farming community in Wisconsin. For most of his life, he was known to his neighbors as a shy and somewhat odd handyman, the kind of person you might pass on the street without giving a second thought. But in 1957, the town of Plainfield was shaken to its core when authorities discovered what Edward Gein had been doing behind the closed doors of his isolated farmhouse. What they found there would go on to shock the entire nation, and it would change the way Americans thought about the people living quietly among them. This is a story that begins not with the crimes themselves, but much earlier, with a lonely childhood on a remote farm, a domineering mother, and a boy who never learned how to find his place in the world. It is the story of Edward Gein, the butcher of Plainfield. Edward Theodore Gein was born in La Crosse County, in the state of Wisconsin, on the 27th of August, 1906. He was the second of two sons, born to George Philip Gein and Augusta Wilhelmine Gein. Both of his parents were of German descent, and Edward's only sibling was an older brother by the name of Henry. From the very beginning, the Gein household was shaped by the will of one person, and that person was Augusta. She was a fervently religious woman, nominally Lutheran in her faith, and she held strong and unwavering beliefs about the world around her. She made certain that her two sons heard those beliefs often, and that they understood them deeply. She would preach to Edward and Henry about what she saw as the innate immorality of the world and the evils of drinking. She warned them again and again that all women were naturally promiscuous and that they were instruments of the devil. Every afternoon, without exception, Augusta reserved time to read to her sons from the Bible. She usually chose verses from the Old Testament and the Book of Revelation, passages that dealt with death, murder, and divine retribution. These were the words that filled the Gein home day after day, year after year. And over time, young Edward came to idolize his mother, and that admiration slowly grew into something deeper, something closer to obsession. While the family was still living in La Crosse, Edward's father George worked as a carpenter, a tanner, and a firefighter. For a time, he also owned a local grocery store, but he soon sold the business. After that, George moved the family out of La Crosse and onto a 155-acre farm in the town of Plainfield, Wisconsin. This remote and isolated farm would become the family's permanent home. George Gein was known to be a violent alcoholic, and he regularly beat both of his sons. When his father struck him on the head, Edward's ears would ring from the force of the blows. Augusta, for her part, took full advantage of the farm's isolation. She deliberately turned away any outsiders who might have influenced her boys. She wanted to keep them close, and she wanted to keep them entirely under her control. Because of this, Edward only ever left the farm to attend school. Outside of those hours in the classroom, he spent most of his time doing chores around the property. He was a shy and quiet child, and he kept largely to himself. His classmates and teachers remembered him as having strange mannerisms, such as seemingly random bursts of laughter, as if he were laughing at his own private jokes that no one else could hear. According to family acquaintances, Augusta punished Edward whenever he tried to make friends. And yet, despite his poor social development, Edward actually did fairly well in school, particularly when it came to reading. On the 1st of April, 1940, George Gein died of heart failure at the age of 66. With their father gone, the responsibility of keeping the family afloat fell to Edward and Henry. The two brothers began doing odd jobs around town to help cover their living expenses. They were generally considered reliable and honest by the rest of the community, and both of them found steady work as handymen. Edward, in particular, frequently babysat for neighbors, and he seemed to relate more easily to children than he did to adults. As the years went on, Henry began to pull away from the family. He started dating a divorced mother of two, and he made plans to move in with her. Henry worried openly about his younger brother's deep attachment to their mother, and he often spoke ill of Augusta around Edward. Each time he did, Edward responded with shock and hurt. Then, on the 16th of May, 1944, something happened that would change everything. Henry was out on the property that day, burning away marsh vegetation, when the fire grew beyond his control. The local fire department had to be called in to help put out the flames. By the end of that long day, after the fire had been extinguished and the firefighters had gone home, Edward reported that his brother Henry was missing. A search party was quickly formed, and they went out into the darkening evening with lanterns and flashlights. They found 43-year-old Henry lying face down on the ground, already dead. It appeared that he had been dead for some time before they discovered him. The initial belief was that heart failure had been the cause, since his body showed no signs of burns or other visible injuries. However, it was later reported by biographer Harold Schechter that Henry did in fact have bruises on his head. Despite this, police dismissed the possibility of foul play. The county coroner eventually listed asphyxiation as the official cause of death. The authorities accepted that it had been nothing more than an accident, and no formal investigation was ever conducted. No autopsy was performed. It would not be until years later, in 1957, that questions about Henry's death would surface again. While questioning Edward about the murder of a woman named Bernice Worden, state investigator Joe Wilimovsky raised the matter of what had really happened to Henry. George Arndt, who studied the case in detail, later wrote that in retrospect it was, in his words, possible and likely that Henry's death represented the Cain and Abel aspect of this case. With Henry now gone, Edward and his mother Augusta were left entirely alone on the farm. Shortly after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a paralyzing stroke, and Edward devoted himself completely to her care. Then sometime in 1945, an incident took place that seemed to affect Augusta deeply. Edward later recounted that he and his mother had gone to visit a man named Smith who lived nearby, in order to purchase straw. While they were there, Augusta witnessed Smith beating a dog. A woman from inside the Smith residence came outside and yelled for him to stop, but Smith beat the animal to death regardless. Augusta was extremely upset by this scene, though what seemed to bother her most was not the brutality toward the dog. What disturbed her, rather, was the presence of the woman herself. Augusta told her son that the woman was not married to Smith and therefore had no business being there, angrily calling her Smith's harlot. Not long after this incident, Augusta suffered a second stroke, and from that point on, her health deteriorated rapidly. Edward Gein died on the 29th of December, 1945, at the age of 67. Edward was devastated by her death. In the words of biographer Harold Schechter, he had lost his only friend and one true love, and he was absolutely alone in the world. After his mother's passing, Edward held onto the family farm and continued to earn what money he could from odd jobs around town. But life inside the farmhouse began to change in a strange and unsettling way. Edward boarded up the rooms that his mother had used, including the upstairs, the downstairs parlor, and the living room. He left them completely untouched, as though preserving them exactly as they had been when she was alive. While the rest of the house grew increasingly squalid and neglected over time, those particular rooms remained pristine, almost frozen in place. Edward himself lived in just a small room next to the kitchen. It was around this time that he developed new interests. He began reading pulp magazines and adventure stories, and he was particularly drawn to accounts involving cannibals or Nazi atrocities. He developed a specific fascination with the case of Ilse Koch, a woman who had been accused of selecting tattooed prisoners for death in order to fashion objects from their skin. In 1951, Edward began receiving a farm subsidy from the federal government. He occasionally worked for the local municipal road crew and also joined crop thrashing crews in the Plainfield area from time to time. Sometime between 1946 and 1956, he sold an 80-acre parcel of land that had once belonged to his brother Henry. To the outside world, Edward Gein appeared to be nothing more than a quiet, odd, and lonely man, getting by on very little. But behind the walls of that farmhouse, something far darker was already beginning to take shape. On the morning of the 16th of November, 1957, 58-year-old Bernice Worden, who owned the hardware store in Plainfield, disappeared. Her store's truck was seen driving out from the rear of the building at around 9:30 that morning. Throughout the rest of the day, the hardware store saw very few customers, and some area residents believed this was simply because of deer hunting season. It was not until later that afternoon at around 5 o'clock that Worden's son, Deputy Sheriff Frank Worden, entered the store. What he found inside was deeply troubling. The cash register was open and there were blood stains on the floor. Frank Worden told investigators that on the evening before his mother's disappearance, Edward Gein had come into the store. Gein had mentioned that he planned to return the following morning to purchase a gallon of antifreeze. As it turned out, a sales slip for that antifreeze was the last receipt written by Bernice Worden on the morning she vanished. That same evening, Gein was arrested at a grocery store in West Plainfield. The Washoe County Sheriff's Department then launched a search of the Gein farm. What they found there would become one of the most disturbing discoveries in American criminal history. A sheriff's deputy found the body of Bernice Worden inside a shed on the property. She had been killed with a .22 caliber rifle, and her remains had been handled in a way that was difficult for even seasoned investigators to comprehend. As authorities continued to search the rest of Gein's house, they uncovered a large collection of items crafted from human remains. There were bones and fragments found throughout the property, along with household objects that had been fashioned from human skin and bone. Skulls had been repurposed in various ways, some mounted on furniture, others shaped into bowls. There were pieces of clothing made from human skin, as well as masks crafted from the faces of the dead. The remains of both Bernice Worden and a woman named Mary Hogan, who had been missing for years, were found among the items in the house. All of these artifacts were carefully photographed at the State Crime Laboratory, and afterward they were decently disposed of. When investigators sat Gein down for questioning, he began to tell them a story that stretched back years. He said that between 1947 and 1952, he had made as many as 40 nighttime visits to 3 local graveyards in order to dig up recently buried bodies. He described carrying out these visits while in what he called a daze-like state. On roughly 30 of those occasions, he said that he came out of the daze while still at the cemetery, and on those nights he simply left the grave in good order and returned home empty-handed. But on the remaining visits, he dug up the graves of recently buried middle-aged women whom he felt resembled his mother. He brought those bodies home with him, where he tanned their skins and used them to create his various items. In total, Gein admitted to stealing from 9 graves, and he personally led investigators to each one. Alan Wilimowski of the State Crime Laboratory took part in opening 3 of those graves as a test. The caskets were found inside wooden boxes, with the top boards running crossways rather than lengthwise. The tops of these boxes sat about 2 feet below the surface in sandy soil. It became clear that Gein had robbed the graves shortly after the funerals had taken place, while the burial sites were still incomplete. The reason authorities had chosen to exhume these test graves was that they were not certain the slight-framed Gein could have single-handedly dug up a grave in the span of a single evening. But what they found inside matched his account closely. One casket was completely empty. Another was also empty, but contained a few remaining bones along with Gein's own crowbar. The final casket still held most of the body, though parts were missing, and it appeared that Gein had returned some items to it. In this way, Gein's confession was largely corroborated by the physical evidence. As the investigation deepened, a disturbing picture of Gein's motives began to emerge. Investigators came to understand that soon after his mother's death, Gein had begun constructing a suit made from human skin. His intention, as it was later understood, was to become his mother, to inhabit her likeness as closely as he could. When asked about the bodies, he denied having any sexual contact with the corpses he had exhumed, explaining simply that they smelled too bad. During his interrogation at the State Crime Laboratory, Gein also admitted to shooting 51-year-old Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had been missing since the 8th of December, 1954. Her remains were later found in his house, though he denied any memory of the specific details surrounding her death. There was also the account of a 16-year-old youth whose parents had been friends of Gein. The boy had attended baseball games and movies with Gein over the years, and he later reported that Gein had kept what appeared to be shrunken heads in his house. Gein had told the boy they were relics sent by a cousin who had served in the Philippines during the Second World War. But upon investigation, police determined that these were in fact something else entirely, items made from human remains that Gein had used as masks. During the course of questioning, it also came to light that Sheriff Art Schley had reportedly assaulted Gein, slamming his head and face into a brick wall. Because of this, Gein's initial confession was ruled inadmissible in court. Schley himself died of heart failure in 1968 at the age of 43, before Gein's case ever went to trial. Many people who knew Schley believed that he had been deeply affected by the horror of what he had witnessed on Gein's property, and that this, combined with the fear of having to testify about his assault on Gein, contributed to his early death. Beyond the 2 murders he confessed to, Gein was also considered a suspect in several other unsolved cases across the state of Wisconsin. In November of 1957, authorities confronted him with a number of missing persons cases that had occurred in the years between his mother's death and the murder of Bernice Worden. Their suspicions had been further heightened by the discovery of Mary Hogan's remains on his property. However, lie detector tests failed to connect Gein to any additional murders, and his psychiatrists ultimately concluded that his violence was directed only toward women who physically resembled his mother. One of the unsolved cases was the disappearance of 8-year-old Georgia Jean Weckler, who vanished near her home in Fort Atkinson at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on the 1st of May, 1947. Earlier that day, she had been given a ride home from her grade school in Jefferson by a neighbor, who dropped her off at the lane leading from the highway to the Weckler farm. She was last seen pausing at the family mailbox, reaching in to remove a stack of mail. After that, she was never seen again. Witnesses reported seeing a dark-colored, possibly black, 1936 Ford sedan with a gray plastic spotlight in the area that afternoon. Gein himself was known to own a black 1937 Ford. Another case that drew attention was that of 14-year-old Evelyn Grace Hartley, who went missing on the evening of the 24th of October, 1953. That night, she had been babysitting a 20-month-old girl at the home of a college professor. When she failed to check in with her father as planned at 8:30, he called the residence several times but received no answer. Growing concerned, he drove to the house himself. He found the doors locked, the lights and radio still on, and items scattered throughout the home. The living room furniture had been moved around to different places, as had Evelyn's school books. Her father found her shoes in separate rooms, one upstairs and one downstairs, and he discovered her broken glasses on the upper floor. But Evelyn herself was nowhere to be found. After Gein's arrest, he was questioned about Hartley's disappearance, but he denied any involvement and passed 2 separate lie detector tests. Police found no trace of her remains during their search of Gein's property. There was also the case of 42-year-old Victor Harold Travis, a resident of Adams County, who went out to hunt deer on the 1st of November, 1952, in the company of an acquaintance named Raymond Burgess. In the late afternoon, the pair stopped for refreshments at a bar in Plainfield and stayed for several hours. At around 7 o'clock in the evening, they left the bar together, got into Burgess's car, and drove away. Neither of the 2 men nor the car they were driving was ever seen again. No trace of them was ever found. It was later noted that Travis and Burgess had been hunting on the property next to Gein's farm, and that Gein had objected to their presence there on the very day they disappeared. Finally, Gein was tentatively linked to the disappearance of his neighbor, 32-year-old James Walsh, who vanished in June of 1954. Walsh and his wife had lived near Gein, and after her husband went missing, Gein began performing chores for Mrs. Walsh. None of these cases were ever solved, and Gein was never formally charged in connection with any of them. On the 21st of November, 1957, just days after his arrest, Edward Gein was arraigned on 1 count of first-degree murder in Waushara County Court. He entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Following a psychiatric examination, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia and found to be mentally incompetent, making him unfit to stand trial. As a result, Gein was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane, a maximum security facility located in Waupun, Wisconsin. He was later transferred to the Mendota Mental Health Institute in the city of Madison. And there he remained year after year, as the world outside continued to talk about what had been found on his farm. More than a decade would pass before Edward Gein set foot in a courtroom again. In 1968, doctors finally determined that he was, in their words, mentally able to confer with counsel and participate in his own defense. The trial began on the 7th of November, 1968, and it lasted 1 week. During the proceedings, a psychiatrist testified that Gein had told him he did not know whether the killing of Bernice Worden had been intentional or accidental. Gein had explained that while he was examining a gun inside Worden's store, the weapon discharged on its own and killed her. He claimed that he had not aimed the rifle at Worden, and that he could not remember anything else that happened on the morning of her death. At the request of the defense, Gein's trial was held without a jury. Judge Robert H. Gallmer presided over the case. On the 14th of November, Judge Gallmer found Gein guilty of the murder of Bernice Worden. But the trial did not end there. A second phase then dealt with the question of Gein's sanity at the time of the crime. After hearing testimony from doctors called by both the prosecution and the defense, Judge Gallmer ruled Gein not guilty by reason of insanity. He ordered Gein committed once again to the Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. Edward Gein would never be a free man again, and he would spend the rest of his life confined within the walls of a mental institution. Judge Gallmer later wrote that due to prohibitive costs, Gein had been tried for only one murder, that of Bernice Worden, though he had also admitted to killing Mary Hogan. With Gein locked away, the question of what to do with his property still remained. His house, the outbuildings, and his 195-acre farm were appraised at a total value of $4,700. His possessions were scheduled to be auctioned off on the 30th of March, 1958. In the meantime, rumors began to spread that the house and the land it stood on might be turned into a tourist attraction, a destination for the morbidly curious. But that would never come to pass. Early on the morning of the 20th of March, 10 days before the planned auction, the house was destroyed by fire. A deputy fire marshal reported that a garbage fire had been set roughly 75 feet from the house by a cleaning crew who had been tasked with disposing of refuse from the property. Hot coals were recovered from the spot where the bonfire had been, but the fire marshal noted that the flames had not spread along the ground from that location to the house itself. Arson was widely suspected, but the cause of the fire was never officially determined. It has since been noted that the fire may not have been treated as a matter of great urgency by Fire Chief Frank Worden, who was, of course, the son of Gein's victim Bernice Worden. When Gein himself was told about the fire while in detention, he simply shrugged and offered 2 quiet words just as well. There was one other piece of Gein's property that found a buyer. His Ford sedan, the very car he had used to transport the bodies of his victims, was sold at public auction for $760. It was purchased by a carnival sideshow operator named Bunny Gibbons, who went on to charge carnival goers 25 cents admission simply to look at the vehicle. The current whereabouts of that car are unknown. Edward Gein spent his remaining years quietly, confined to the Mendota Mental Health Institute. On the 26th of July, 1984, he died there of respiratory failure, secondary to lung cancer. He was 77 years old. His body was taken back to Plainfield, the town where it had all begun, and he was laid to rest in the local cemetery. He was interred between his parents and his brother Henry, the same family that had shaped the course of his entire life. In the years that followed, souvenir seekers found their way to his grave and chipped away small pieces from his gravestone, bit by bit, as though even in death, people wanted to take something of Edward Gein home with them. Eventually, in the year 2000, the gravestone itself was stolen entirely. It was recovered in June of 2001 near the city of Seattle in the state of Washington. But the stone was not returned to the cemetery. Instead, it was placed in storage at the Washoe County Sheriff's Department, where it has remained ever since. And so, since that time, the gravesite of Edward Gein has been left unmarked, with nothing to show that he was ever there at all.